Good afternoon. Next up on the Atrium stage is Unlocking Future Mobility Through Connected Vehicles.
Thank you all for joining us for this panel. And it's kind of in some ways, a follow-on to the last session we just did on the state of autonomy. This time, our panelists are going to talk about connectivity, which is one of the key components that's going to be crucial for enabling mobility in the future and mobility services. And so we're going to start off to my left here with Uli Mensch, the Global Vice President for Auto Industry for SAP. Uli, give us a little insight into what you do.
Yeah, so I'm leading the automotive industry vertical in SAP. SAP you probably most know as the enterprise application software provider, international, globally active, but we have 25 industry verticals in SAP, and SAP is one of the largest ones there with more than 7,000 automotive customers in 106 countries. So, and we're not doing just ERP back office enterprise applications. We are also going into customer experience and connected vehicle, IoT, analytics, blockchain, you name it. So well-kept secret for some and a recipe for success for others.
And next to Uli, we have Kevin Mall, who is the Director of Connected Mobility Solutions for Bosch, one of the world's largest automotive suppliers. Kevin, what are you doing these days?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So good afternoon, everyone. Kevin Mall. I'm pleased to say that I'm a Detroit resident, and if you look at the image behind me here, we could do a little Where's Waldo and try to pick out all the different modes of modality that are represented in that image. I think it's pretty easy to let your imagination wander and say, wow, that looks a lot like Campus Martius. So this is representative of my responsibilities with Bosch. I am working in our Connected Mobility Solutions division. This is a new division that was formed in the beginning of 2018, and it represents Bosch's recognition of some of the macro trends that are happening right now that are underpinned by connected, electrified, and automated. So I represent the connected side of that, and we're working on a bunch of multimodality solutions and things that can support the vehicle and provide great UX for the driver, who has now become the center of the mobility solution as opposed to the vehicle itself. Thanks, Sam.
And next to Kevin, we have Colin Dillon, the Chief Technical Officer for APMA.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. My name's Colin Dillon. I'm from the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association in Canada. My responsibilities are to help launch connected and autonomous vehicle technology. And we can do that in a smart city of the city of Stratford, which is really like the KPMG would describe an island of autonomy, a place where you can actually test autonomous technology, connected technology. And so this will kind of bring together about 20 vehicles, about 200 companies' technologies that are mounted and fitted and installed and integrated onto these vehicles. And these then can be showcased globally to the OEMs.
And Gavin Sherry, the CEO of Autonomic.
Hi, everybody. Autonomic is a company that builds and operates cloud software that connects the diverse elements of the transportation ecosystem, be they cars, be they scooters, be they mass transit, with developers in a very modern, global way, reminiscent of other tech companies like AWS or Google.
And finally, we have Dr. Shomit Ghosh, the CEO and President of P3.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Maybe a quick word on P3. We provide consulting and innovative engineering solutions to OEMs and Tier 1s globally to accelerate the development of mobility services and mobility products. P3 is a global company. We have about 4,000 consultants and engineers worldwide. It's not only automotive what we do. We have a very strong footing in the telecommunication industry, in aerospace and in energy. Within automotive, it's mostly case technology. So I'm very excited for today's panel where we're focusing on connected mobility to talk about several things. I don't want to go into all the topics, but happy to talk about car mesh technologies, where we currently are in the process of setting up a joint venture with a global major OEM. Happy to talk about our crowdsourced mobility solutions, where we collect 1.5 billion data points per day, and also about our collaboration with Amazon Alexa, which we just announced last week in Las Vegas, where we do the system integration of Alexa into the vehicle. So very exciting, looking forward to the panel.
All right. So it used to be that the car was a place where we could be isolated from the world and kind of get away from it all. You were disconnected from everything. Now it's something, it's rapidly becoming something completely different. We're getting to the point where almost 100% of new cars are connected, and the modern vehicle is becoming a conduit for omnidirectional communications. We started off about 20 or so years ago with OnStar, with some services like remote locking and unlocking and emergency assistance. But for the customer, what do you see as some of the most important benefits, features that are made possible by the technologies we have today? We have LTE in most new cars today, and in a few years we'll be starting to roll out 5G. What does it do for consumers?
Well, if I can take it, if I can go first here. So I think in the broadest sense, to me, the connected vehicle allows us to increase utilization of the asset. And that, to me, is the biggest thing at all. There's many small pieces that come together, but ultimately, with connected vehicles, we really can increase the use of the vehicle that is typically 95–96% sitting somewhere in a parking lot or in a garage. And I live in the state of Delaware. I've heard that if you connect all the parking lots that are built for our vehicles, you could basically fill the state of Delaware. I mean, isn't that crazy? So if we can increase utilization, we will have a better utilization of the asset. We will lower the cost per mile, and will probably deal better with traffic situations, with air pollution and all these kind of things. So ultimately, to me, that's the biggest deal.
Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Uli. I think that's a big improvement that's going to come. But I also think that it's also about making that user experience better. And if you think of a mobile phone and what people expect from their car, basically emulates what's happening on their mobile phone. And with some of the new technologies that are coming, that can become more demand-based, more contextual, where you're using things like sensor fusion to improve the experience for the user. One example that I could give from Bosch's perspective, we're working on something called community-based parking, where we're using the ultrasonic sensor data that's on the vehicle to identify available parking on the street. And then we push that up to the cloud, curate it with some other relevant information, and then push it back down to the HMI in the vehicle, and then all of a sudden the driver gets real-time parking information about where an available space is on the street. It's this more demand-based information and the sensor fusion that's allowing that to happen. So I think those
you can do that without having to embed sensors in every parking space. It's using the technology that's already out there on the road.
Yeah, the vehicle's already equipped with it, zero infrastructure cost.
Colin?
We'll get to that point about putting sensors in the roads and into infrastructure, because I'm a big supporter and a proponent of making sure the cities develop at the same pace as our vehicles are, or transportation or mobility. But for me, connected technology has helped to really support and strengthen safety, security and comfort. If you look at ADAS and if you look at all the connected components and features, it's beginning to make driving more safer than it ever has been. We all throw out stats of 96 or 94% of all accidents are human error, leaving the remaining few percent to be a mechanical failure. I think the objective for our industry has always been, with the introduction of the seatbelt and other features in the vehicles over the past 70 years, is to improve safety. But I think going forward with the connected vehicle and the semi-autonomous vehicles and the collection of data and tech, security is critical as well.
Gavin, your company is doing something a little different with the Transportation Mobility Cloud. Where do you see the consumer benefit coming from the work that you're doing?
It's a good question. By bringing together the diverse aspects of the transportation ecosystem, say beginning with vehicles, we're able to present that to developers in a way that they're reminiscent of in the smartphone area or in other cloud solutions. And what that creates is a sort of test bed of innovation. And I feel strongly that we're just at the very beginning of the connected vehicle era, where the very fact that we're talking about car unlock and remote start and stuff like that is somewhat reminiscent of the 1990s when we began to explore the power of the internet. My question is, like, what is the Instagram of the connected car? What is the Google of the connected car? And I suspect that we're quite close to that era, what with the advent of things like 5G, more pervasive technology, but something that we've come to learn and what we believe very fully in with TMC is that we need a common platform where that data shows up, which is built for developers, not for the industry or for automotive engineering purposes, for modern software developers that are used to other systems, such as those of consumer internet companies.
So I think, Kevin, what you just said is very important, right? When we look at, for example, the remote unlock feature or lock feature, so you hit that button on your phone and then you wait. And then after maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever, that little pin on the door pops up, right? That's not really like a good customer experience. So when we look at what are the take rates of connected services after the initial trial period runs out, it's probably around 20 to 30%. So how do you make money with these type of services? They're not good enough that people want to pay for it. And I think what really is like what you call the Instagram would be if there is like real-time adaptation of like how features and services in your car actually work. And just maybe a couple of examples. Tesla was able during the hurricanes in Florida, with basically over the air, to change basically the range of the batteries, to get people quicker out of the hurricane area. That's a real benefit. Or in the consumer electronics world, if you don't like the intro at Netflix, that they play the trailer, you just click it away. And after several times, they're not even offering this anymore to you because they've learned how you basically interact with the system and what your preference is. So I think this is the opportunity if we can approach and apply these type of approaches into the vehicle, that there's real benefit. That is not just like unlock or lock. And for that, though, it needs much better over-the-air capabilities that, in our opinion at P3, there's still a gap in the market to basically bring this to the market. Not every OEM is ready to do this, right? And I think that's where the opportunity sits, though.
Yeah, to that question of over the air, the traditional model in the auto industry has always been essentially to sell it and forget it. You design, develop, and build a vehicle, you sell it to a customer, and then you're on to developing the next generation of that vehicle. And you're not doing those continuous updates on the vehicle. Tesla has kind of shown a new direction to do that. As we get into automated vehicles, we're definitely going to have to do that. We're going to have to do functional and safety and cybersecurity updates over the life of that vehicle in order to keep it safe. But there's also a significant cost associated with that. Where are the benefits for manufacturers in doing that? And what's the business model going to be? If you have to spend this money to continually support your products after you've sold them, how's that going to work?
I think, Sam, a lot of what you said as it relates to how to make money from an asset that needs to be maintained, that needs to be kept up over time. There is cost involved in this process. There is security aspects involved. There is ultimately the question of consumer benefits and the true value of certain features or sometimes gimmicks. To your example of unlocking the car, to me is what is the true added value, And you know, people, you know, if someone says, hey, you know, I have my shopping bags and I don't have to fumble my keyboard, now I have to fumble my phone, you know, what's the benefit? So, but I truly see a ton of really high value use cases. And maybe what we will see here is similar to what's in the smartphone industry. You know, the apps really make the value of the device. Without the apps, the device is not that useful. And I see something similar, very similar, coming up also in the mobility sphere, where we will see much more a model of subscriptions. And subscriptions will feed the effort to on an ongoing basis, maintain and keep that asset up to date. And earlier today there was a session here around where there was a lot of talk about the digital twin, so the digital representation of a physical asset. And connected technology allows us to really today handle this very, very elegantly and with high levels of security. And I think we're now getting into the more industrial grade applications where this makes sense, and ultimately where we can also make not only provide value to consumers, but also make it attractive for businesses to invest.
I mean, Sam, I think if you know, going back to your question, if you always keep the user at the center of the experience, the mobility user, whether it's, you know, the vehicle of today or the robo-taxi of tomorrow, you know, two really quick use cases. You know, today, if there needs to be a software update on the vehicle and the consumer doesn't need to be involved in that, then just push it out and they're not engaged. But if, for example, they do need to come back to the service center, then try to make that experience as easy and valuable as possible and engage them in the process. In the world of a robo-taxi down the road, it's not just about keeping that vehicle operating, but again, from a user experience, how do you know when that vehicle needs to be cleaned? How do you know if there's debris inside of it? There's not going to be any driver there to take care of that. So things like in-vehicle sensing, cameras, smoke detectors, object left behind, these are ways that the manufacturers can still provide a great user experience and keep their operating costs down by managing that experience end to end.
I think the current OEMs, or the general OEMs that we all know, need to be shook and given a bit of a wake-up call. I think Tesla should have done that, but I don't believe they have been able to. And I'm hoping the likes of Rivian and Bollinger, these new kids on the block, as we could call them, because yesterday I was on the stage, we were judging the best cars and the best production, best interiors for the North American National Auto Show, and we were still seeing interior design and components and gadgets which have been around for over 20 years. Yet, if we talk about added technology and connected technology in a vehicle, we all appreciate what Tesla has been able to do with their price point. You know, their Model 3 has already outsold the Corolla on an annual volume, and the S and the X are vehicles which are over $100,000 Canadian dollars. So if that's not an incentive to move into the tech and to provide tech at that level, then I really don't know what is. You know, if you sit inside a Tesla, all the controls, all the buttons beyond the hazard light are all on that stack, that 17-inch screen or that 19-inch screen. And so how the rest aren't replicating that boggles my mind. And the reality is they've got an opportunity to either do so and adapt to the technology. And if I could put a footnote in that, you know, we all know Tesla was a tech company that built cars, but you know, the larger OEMs need to move and maneuver if they can, because otherwise these new kids on the block can pivot and probably you know, displace these companies in the next few years. But I actually see an opportunity for them to make more money by putting a larger price tag by adding more technology.
I'll be more provocative still. The benefit to the OEMs of OTA is the right to survival. The hallmark of great consumer products that many of you I can see are holding in the audience here today is that they get better after you buy them. This is very rare a concept within the auto industry, and it must become the standard because we have seen peak vehicle ownership.
I think the OEMs can benefit for their own development purposes from a direct understanding of what the end consumers do with the product and what they like and what they don't like. For example, premium OEMs, they're selling great navigation systems and maps, and they put a lot of extra money into highlighting point of interest and like bringing it up on the display and all that. But do they really know, and not only through car clinics, but like real-time feedback from like all the users, what do they actually like and whether that money was well spent or is not well spent? And I think that's the opportunity with and I think, Sam, you said it, with bidirectional or omnidirectional connectivity, right? It's not only like into the vehicle, it's especially out of the vehicle, so that you basically can glean what is working, what resonates, and how do I have to improve or change things. And then, of course, the ability to change it rapidly. And if you think this thought through, it, I think, impacts the entire supply chain. Because if you want to change software that you have developed now with suppliers and maybe with sub-suppliers, or you need like a couple of suppliers to bring it together, and then you say, guys, we need to change something here, it's a very slow process, right? Because you need to go back, you need to get aligned. They probably all want to have extra money for the new development or the further development of the feature, et cetera, et cetera. So your response time is very, very long, and you can't really like learn so much from it, right? And I think as long as that doesn't change, and the OEM probably has more oversight and supervision and also like hands-on in the software development of the products that they offer, they will always be at a slighter disadvantage versus companies like the new kids on the block or even Tesla that do much more of the software development in-house.
With all this data that's coming out of the vehicles, you know, the manufacturing vehicles is a very complex process, as we all know. You know, you've got huge supply chains, you've got hundreds of suppliers, and you've got to coordinate all of this stuff. And the development process is also equally complicated and fraught with opportunities for failure. You know, can this data that is being collected from vehicles, telemetry data and usage data, you know, customer usage data, how can that help to maybe streamline that or, you know, eliminate some of the potential pitfalls?
I think we have the technology already available today to do a lot more than what's been done. So we're talking about telematics data from vehicles, and that's the logical piece, right? And integrating that into a feedback loop with suppliers, with product development. This, you know, we see some of that already today, and that's all great. But there's a lot more that's possible. For example, to tap into not just the data from the vehicle, but also the data and the sentiment of the user, right? So there is technology available that allows us to identify, you know, how happy is the person in the vehicle, and is the user, you know, maybe cursing about certain features, and that provides a lot more higher quality feedback that can be used to improve the product. And if it's software based, then it can be fixed rather quickly. You know, unfortunately, also the reality is that the lifespan of hardware in vehicles varies quite a bit, right? As we drive vehicles sometimes 15 years, certain electronics components are outdated after 1 or 2 years. And I think we'll see much more ways of swapping certain, you know, technology hardware in vehicles to allow certain things. So for example, in my vehicle that's not that old, I cannot use Apple CarPlay because the hardware is outdated. Can't believe it. But so I think there's a lot of things that are possible that are not yet used to the full potential. But with that happening, I see another step change, and it's going to be game changing for those who are really adopting this, and maybe it's not, maybe, you know, the question is who is going to be on the forefront, right? I mean, Tesla has proven they're very, very good at that. I think the likes of Rivian and Byton, they strike me as being also very out there. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously Bosch is working with virtually every manufacturer around the world, and you know, trying to help them solve those problems. And the life cycle of that development is, you know, can be up to 2 years, and by the time the vehicle's on the road, a lot of the technology is already getting outdated. So I think, as Uli said, it's about if you've got, you know, the right-based components in the vehicle, and then you're able to serve information to that user, and then you're able to monitor their reaction to it. So back to one of my earlier responses around those demand-based services, then you can continue to refine and curate what you're putting at the end user, and you can overcome a lot of those challenges that are driven by you know, older technology that's on the vehicle as it goes through its life cycle.
I think the data is going to be of value to the OEM themselves, obviously, hopefully for, you know, continuous improvement. But there's obviously a value for data being collected, just like Facebook, Instagram, and everybody else is collecting our data and monetizing it. But the question is, how do they continue to move forward and to be able to support, you know, because you mentioned, you know, an OEM has multiple suppliers, you know. You can talk about over 30,000 components or parts on any given vehicle. And for me, an OEM is like a marketplace that's basically bringing all these goods together and kind of assembling them in under one roof. That model has to change. And again, in my previous life, I worked for a tier 1 supplier that supplied to Tesla. And their approach to their supply chain was quite different to, let's say, the Detroit 3. So I think, you know, I'm not really trying to harp at or go at the current OEMs, but I really do see them as these large, you know, ocean liners. And I see the other folks as being these little speedboats. And I think there's going to be a lot of changes that need to go on, you know, from a supply chain base, from what you do with the data. For example, with a Tesla, I can buy that without its autopilot package. If you leave a dealership here in Michigan and you don't buy something necessarily, you either have to go aftermarket or go back and pay through the nose. But with a Tesla, I can then, you know, a few weeks later actually go onto the stack and choose to make purchase because it's software, it's downloadable, it's in the cloud. That kind of approach to customer service is something that they have to, you know, get their hands around before they're actually looking from outside in.
Something I find really surprising to add on to that in this industry is that there are roughly 1 billion vehicles on the road. Insufficiently few of those are actually connected, about 5%, but we're working on that as an industry. But given 1 billion vehicles on the road, many of these vehicles, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, if not substantially more, they represent one of the most expensive assets that any given person would own. And yet, insufficient attention is paid in the way that we've been talking about to how the customer interacts with the vehicle, where they see value, where they find inconvenience or annoyance. An order of magnitude or 2 more than your average consumer internet company, and yet at those consumer internet companies, people pour over the human interaction model with the product, with the application, in a way that I rarely, if ever, see within the automotive industry. That is something that must change as we see the advent of internet companies building vehicles or supporting the building of vehicles, particularly in China, where the industry has grown up at the same time as they've grown up with mobile and consumer internet technology.
So we see 2 challenges. One is like OEMs need to have a data usage strategy, right? Because you collect like, even let's assume you get the data out and then what, right? If you don't use the data in a way that you basically draw the right conclusions and you know what you're looking for and which dots you need to connect, you will not get meaningful information out of it that you can then basically feed back into your processes. And the second challenge that we see is how ready are traditional OEMs, whether they're in Asia, they're in Europe, or they're here, to actually embrace this, because the organizational setup is of such that it's like, okay, we basically develop components and then we screw them all together, and then it's called a car. We sell it and we forget it and we turn on to the next generation, right? And so if your organizational setup doesn't change, so what do you do and how do you learn from it? Because now you're getting feedback as you basically are going not only through development but deployment. Yeah, and that is a completely different way of how you can react or have to react to it. And we see that a lot of the OEMs, as well as tier ones, they struggle with this. Yeah, how do I change my organization, my setup, my processes, my culture, my understanding, my position in the marketplace in such a fashion that I'm quick enough to embrace the opportunity that presents itself.
Going back to Colin, your comments on being able to buy autopilot after the fact, after you've driven home with the car, doing things like that requires the manufacturer to actually build in hardware, though. I mean, yes, it's a software purchase, it's a software upgrade, but the software only works if there's hardware for it to run on, which means that Tesla has to build in the autopilot hardware into every car they build, whether they sell autopilot or not. One of the classic problems that we've had in this industry is, because of the lead times in development, and also because of the harsh environment that cars operate in, we often have hardware that, compared to the latest and greatest, smartphones we have or other consumer technology we use, we end up with hardware that is often, in many ways, out of date by the time it hits the road. How, if affordability is already a problem, average transaction price is about $35,000 now. People are getting 84-month loans. How do we, in mainstream vehicles, build in that how can we afford to build in that hardware, have the latest and greatest technology so that it's not out of date, 2 years after it's on the road, or even the day it hits the road, and still have it be accessible to consumers? Can we generate enough extra revenue? Can manufacturers generate enough extra revenue from this to cover those costs, to keep the vehicles affordable, and at the same time also avoid getting into some of the problems that the technology industry, like with data gathering, Facebook and Google and others. You talked about user sentiment, being able to evaluate user sentiment. I don't know how many people would actually be real happy about the idea of sensors in the car detecting what kind of mood they're in and sharing that to, maybe sell them different products. I mean, so I'll open it up to anybody who wants to respond first.
Yeah,
I think that mobility users are willing to trade their data if they're getting value for it. So I think that we're still working on the strategies to really unlock that value, but by having some basic equipment in the car that can allow you to gather information about what they're doing, I think that the user will gladly let that data go if they're getting value back in return. So some of the examples from earlier. I also think that there's opportunities even on the retrofit side. It was mentioned about the 5% connectivity. I think that one of our partners, Mojo, they've got 1 million users, and they're coming at it from a telco perspective. So they're gaining a lot of visibility to what users are doing. They're making that same kind of data from a retrofit solution actionable to the end user through the smartphone app. So, obviously we got to be very smart about the security of that data, but I really feel like the end user is going to be very flexible in there if they're getting something out of it. You see it in your smartphone all the time. There's a precedent for it.
There were 2 questions in there. To speak to the data privacy one, I think the right thing for the industry is to simply adopt the best-in-class standard, which is to put the control in the hands of users and respect their privacy and have a very rigorous consent framework. And candidly, I think Apple probably has the best one there. I don't work for Apple or have any association with them, but I'm an Apple user, and I think that they've set a very high standard for themselves. I think the automotive industry should adopt exactly the same standard. I think it's insufficient in the Facebook parlance to just stop at "don't be creepy," because it turns out a subjective concept. Relative to improving the vehicles after they're sold, when there's a hardware form factor to this, I see only one real practical long-term solution, which is car-based subscriptions or fractional ownership, shared ownership over time. That means you move away, as Tesla has, thankfully, from the model year sales cycle into a recurring model where people are getting access to new vehicles potentially on a weekly, monthly, or semi-yearly basis. And that means that there's an incentive for the OEMs to compete on new functionality in a very short time frame and provide that to market as rapidly as possible.
Like if you look at how long vehicles are being deployed, I think it doesn't make sense to build some hardware in that you plan on activating, let's say, 7 years down the road with a software update, right? I think you're going to put hardware in right from the get-go that has already some functionality, and then you will add additional functionality onto the same hardware, and maybe you can monetize the add-on functionality through a purchase software update instead of a free one. But I think that strategy goes only so long, right? I don't think you have like certain control units or gateways or that enable certain features that are good now and in 15 years and still provide something new, right? So I think this is just a bridge step, and I like your idea. That's maybe one way out of it. In terms of the privacy, I think every OEM needs to develop its own privacy strategy. What I mean by that is, if you look into the consumer electronics, everybody has developed, while obeying the laws, their different data privacy strategy. Apple collects certain data, yes, but that's about it, right? Whereas Google probably collects everything that they can get and beyond, right? And I think these are choices for the strategy that these companies have done. And the same is like what OEMs will adopt. Eventually, the gatekeeper of that is ultimately the consumer, right? And today, I mean, the last time I read through the T&Cs of my software update on the phone, I can't even remember, and I would ask anyone here who did it, right? You just click I agree, and that's it, right? So technically it's in your hand, but eventually it does have a certain responsibility that sits with the OEM as well because of the default acceptance of the majority of the consumers. Mm-hmm.
So to answer the two questions, I think I may have a Tesla that's a few years old and I need to get the Autopilot 2.0. And that's a $4,000 cost for me to go in and have it updated. And I'll actually do that. And so it basically means they've put cameras in the B pillars, and I have to basically replace the B pillars. And there's, I think, one or two other pieces of technology which have to be hardware that have to be updated. So I think the OEMs need to understand that we, the consumers, may be willing to update tech and hardware and to monetize that. And secondly, when it comes to cybersecurity or privacy, I actually think as an industry, we're lagging behind the banking industry or the financial industry, and the governments are way ahead on cybersecurity. And I think the biggest challenge we're facing is we've got 30,000 components from thousands of suppliers and a supply chain, and you don't know what's clean, what's not been hacked, and whose responsibility truly is that? Is it the OEMs, or is it my responsibility as a tier one who's bringing in two levels of products and components? And so I think on the vehicle itself, I think it needs to be like a Microsoft OS style approach, though it shouldn't be Microsoft. I'm going to fly the Canadian flag and say it should be BlackBerry's QNX OS system. There's no check in the mail for that, by the way. But I truly believe they've got a great OS system. They're already on a lot of vehicles, and they also released last year, actually here on this stage, Jarvis. And Jarvis is a great kind of gap analysis software which runs constantly, whether it's on a vehicle, whether it's on your mobile device, or in a manufacturing facility. I think those need to be installed default, but by all, as opposed to creating these silos where, you know, on the previous panel, people were talking about silos being created and certain kind of autonomous vehicle companies not sharing what they have with others. In reality, I think we're still at that crux, we're still at the infancy of this whole connected autonomous age, and I think it's all about kind of, you know, maybe collaborating versus kind of sticking to your own for dollar value.
To add on to that, if I could, you're completely right. This is reminiscent of Windows 3.1 machines being connected to the internet. A decade of chaos reigned with viruses and Trojan horses and so on that damn near killed Microsoft at some points. And that is what car software largely looks like at this point. Put simply, it was not designed to be connected to the rest of the world. It was not designed with sufficient threat modeling or understanding of the kind of actors that are out there and what they might do. So thankfully, it's not connected to something that could risk people's lives.
And to that point, right, when we think back in those days, like 20 years ago, it's not that long, I would say, but we may all remember that we were replacing DIMM modules for random access memory, right? It was not a uncommon thing to do that once a year because the progress on the hardware side was so quick and you didn't want to buy a new laptop, so it was a natural thing to do. So at the same time, I'm wondering, right, I mean, we're used to replacing tires, we're used to changing our brake pads and our rotors on a regular basis. Why can't we replace certain modules, electronic modules, you know, that may be behind the glove compartment? You know, how can we not design a vehicle with a screen that can be unplugged and I can just put a newer generation LCD screen in there? You know, it's not rocket science. I think we'll see some of that coming, and it's going to be an easy problem to solve. And when we look at commercial vehicles or fleet vehicles, I think we're already there. I mean, that's a no-brainer. There's constantly, you know, updating of the vehicle, and whether that's you know, say police force vehicles with all kinds of equipment in there. So I think we'll see a much more natural way of modularity and
bigger
you know,
modules too. Electric helps us with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you get to the, you know, go past car subscriptions to the autonomous day, you know, robo-taxis and so forth, the variability in the vehicle the complexity will shrink dramatically, and then there will be fleet service strategies where you can bring the fleet in and make those changes. So I think that, I'm not going to say it's going to solve itself, but it will get simpler as we get down the road more to those autonomous models.
As we re-architect the car with this kind of thinking in mind, and do you think that that the industry is thinking enough along those lines of how we re-architect the car to support these kinds of new approaches? Sounds like you, Colin, you don't think so?
I don't think so, no. I'm just about to launch a subcommittee on cybersecurity in Canada because there are so many gaping holes. I won't even call them cracks or gaps. And I've been in the industry and serving the global tier ones for 20 years. I know when I know they know because they tell you. But to be providing electronics and technology and not being provided in the SOP a descriptor of if this thing is kind of hacked, if this thing is being compromised, then you're going to pay for it, kind of a small print, tells me that, yeah, they are being blindsided and they'll continue to be blindsided.
In terms of the re-architecting, the maturity of the industry is such that it's mostly coming from outsiders. You know, Tesla recently in the United States and the newer Chinese OEMs in China. Many of you have probably seen the Bayton vehicle, which has the massive wraparound screen. It's such an obvious idea. Like the second anyone sees it, it's like, I want that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that it will take a generation of the outsiders coming in and showing the more mature participants in the industry what's possible for the more mature players to get re-energized with core in-cabin innovation.
I think, Sam, there's probably 100,000 Bosch engineers that would disagree with a couple of my panel mates that are working on this topic every day.
That's what I want to hear. I want conflict.
across dozens of OEMs. So I think this is a top priority item, and there is a lot of work going into that. Is it maybe manifesting itself yet? Maybe not, but I don't think that it's being ignored.
I think the industry wants to do this. I'm not always sure if they can do it by themselves. I mentioned in the beginning we're setting up a joint venture for car mesh technologies. So the general idea behind that is that when you want to distribute software, you're not just relying on the carrier if you want to do it over the air. So think about you're basically bringing software onto one vehicle, and then that vehicle starts talking to other vehicles around and distributes that software on. That's a completely new technology. The OEM is like, okay, how do we do this? So basically the reason why we're forming this joint venture is we're going to help them with the technology development, building the prototypes, making sure the test and validation of that works, as much as giving ideas into it. So I think it needs partnerships that go beyond the traditional model of like, I'm the OEM and I'm going to put the specs down and I give it to a supplier and then they give me parts. Right? So I think that's the change that has to happen. And as long as that happens, I think the industry could move in the right direction. But the question again is like, is the industry fast enough to embrace that? Because to your point, Kevin, yeah, there's 100,000 engineers that say, we have done it always like this. We're not going to change it, right? And I think that's the pitfall.
And I will let Shomit have the last word on that. Hopefully you all got something useful to think about out of this. I certainly did. And I want to thank my panel, Uli Mensch, Global VP of Auto Industry for SAP, Kevin Mull, Director of Connected Mobility Solutions at Bosch, Colin Dillon, the CTO of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, Gavin Sherry, CEO of Autonomic, and Shomit Ghosh, the CEO and President of P3. Please give the panel a hand. Thank you very much for your attention.